Good evening, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 28th year, I interview poets and other writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. We also have a broader net than just the writers, however. We have had on other brands of artists. We've had on sculptors, musicians, dancers, composers. It's a very, very wide net. So if you have an idea for a guest who might be right for the Writer's Block, whether it's a writer, poet, or another brand, please watch for our address at the end of the program. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block is a product of cable access television. The channel you're watching is cable, and I want you to keep cable. If you go to Dish and you're tempted by those ads, you don't get cable and you don't support Access Television, this wonderful asset for and about Cape Ann people. So stay with us. Tonight, I'm very happy to say I do have a poet as a guest. Her name is Sue Ellen Wedmore, and she is from Rockport. I'm going to read as her introduction a bio paragraph that appears in her latest book, Mind the Light. I'm just going to read straight from the text here. After 24 years working as a speech and language therapist in the public schools, Sue Ellen Wedmore retired to enter the MFA program in poetry at New England College. Now, Poet Laureate Emerita for the small town of Rockport, she has been widely published. Her chapbook, Deployed, won first prize in the Grayson Books annual contest, and her chapbook on marriage and other parallel universes was published by Finishing Line Press. She was awarded first place in the Writer's Digest Rhyming Poetry Contest and recently won first place in the Studios of Key West Robert Frost Contest. 3 of her poems have been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Thanks for being with us, Sue Ellen. I appreciate
I'm excited to be here.
That's an impressive bio. And that doesn't even mention your latest book, Mind the Light, which we're going to get to, and I'm going to ask you to talk about. I want to ask you first, where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
Well, I grew up in the Midwest until I was high school age. We lived in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. And when I was a junior in high school, we moved to Massachusetts. And I went to the University of Massachusetts and got a degree in literature. And then after I had my children, I became a speech and language therapist, which I loved. But all the time, I loved to write ever since I was a teenager. So finally, in 2002, I retired from being a speech and language therapist and went to New England College, which is a low residency program where you go 2 weeks around Christmas and 2 weeks in the summer. And then you have assignments which you fulfill at home and mail them in. And it was a wonderful experience.
Now, that's interesting. You wanted to write from when you were a young girl. You were in high school.
Yes.
Were you writing poems then?
I wrote mostly stories, I think. But it was funny, when I finally moved, we moved to Rockport, and we went out to Thatcher Island. I had this poem about Thatcher Island that just came into my head, and that's when I really started writing seriously again. And then finally I decided I really wanted to focus on that, and so then I applied to the low residency program at New England College.
No, I'm always interested in where inspiration comes from originally. Now, was there somebody in your background, your parents perhaps, or a teacher, or some book you read that really pushed you towards a love of language?
Well, I always read. You know, as a child, I read all the Mary Poppins. My mother loved language, and she loved poetry. She loved Emily Dickinson.
So your mom was a big influence, an important influence.
Yes, she was. And I did dedicate one of my chapbooks to her because I said she believed in me. Yeah.
That's important for parents to believe in their kids.
Yes.
It's wonderful. Another thing that's wonderful is your new chapbook, relatively new chapbook, Mind the Light, because it combines poetry. It is a set of poems, marvelous poems by you, but it's also history and biography. Can you tell us something about the background of Mind the Light? I'm going to hold this up. This is Mind the Light, Sue Ellen Wedmore's new chapbook. Tell us about the background, what this
Well, I
is
really
about.
became inspired going out to Thatcher Island, which, as you know, is an island a mile off the coast of Rockport. And my husband is a volunteer there, and I volunteer also. But I don't do as much work as the rest of them do. I go out and I do paintings. And that's actually where the cover of the chapbook came from, was a painting.
Well, hold that up just a bit more.
It's
So
a
I'm gonna
painting
put this
I
next
did.
to it. This is one of your paintings, and you used it for the cover. Very nice.
Well, after they
Excuse me.
accepted the chapbook, I mentioned that I have a lot of paintings of Thatcher Island, and I sent them copies of about 20. And this was the one that seemed to work the best. But being on Thatcher Island, there's a wonderful story of a Thatcher Island heroine named Maria Bray. And in 1864, this was right before Christmas when the weather changes, as you know, and it can be really, the nor'easters come in. Her husband, who was the lighthouse keeper, Alexander Bray, went ashore with 2 assistant keepers and left her technically alone on the island, although we're not quite sure if she did have some help. But he was gone for 3 days because a nor'easter came in.
And he couldn't get back that 1 mile.
And he couldn't get back that 1 mile. And as you know, there's 2 lighthouses on Thatcher Island that need to be lit. There are 156 stairs. It's not an easy climb. And for 3 days, she, perhaps with her nephew, who was 16 years old, perhaps with a lighthouse keeper's wife, we're not sure. One of the assistant keepers did have a wife there. But she organized it, and she climbed those steps and kept the lights burning for 3 days until Christmas Eve, when her husband was able to get back.
And there is a picture of her in the book.
Yes. There's a picture, actually, of all the lighthouse keepers. I was able to find them, some at the Historical Association, some online.
So maybe we should go back and say this. She is the first of several women profiled in here who
Yes.
all were, at different times, lighthouse keepers.
Yes, so what was interesting was once I got into Maria Bray and I started writing these poems about her, we went to the Lighthouse Museum up in Maine, Rockland, Maine, and I found all these other women lighthouse keepers. And so there are 5 in this book who all have really wonderful, heroic stories attached to them. And then after I finished this book, I even found one in Key West, Florida, a woman lighthouse keeper.
Can you list for us the women who are the keepers that you profile in here in the poems?
So Maria Bray, actually, she was a wife who was a heroine. Catherine Moore went to Fairweather Island, Black Rock Light, when she was only 12. And I was not able to find a picture of Catherine Moore, except there was one photo archived where she was in her 80s and she was missing her teeth. And I thought, that's not fair. I'm not going to put that in. Because she went to that island when she was 12 years old, and she came of age there. So
and you have a picture.
So I painted a picture. I don't know, but I think it suits her because She looks gentle and yet strong. And the editor of the book kind of agreed with me that this would be more appropriate than to put in a picture really in her 80s, where she had spent from age 12 on the island.
Very nice, very nice. And her name again is?
Catherine Moore.
Catherine Moore.
Kate Walker is a really interesting woman lighthouse keeper because she was on what they call a spark plug light in New York Harbor, which meant there was no lawn at all. It was on a rock, on a sand spit. And she ended up being there for like 50 years. She went out with her husband. She was from Germany. And she came here with a young boy. And she fell in love with her husband, John. And they moved. He talked to her. He didn't want to. She wanted to garden. But she ended up on this spark plug light. And then a year later, he died of pneumonia. And she became the lighthouse keeper. And I believe that she was there for like 54 years. She brought up her 2 children there. They came back to help her. But what a heroine. I just can't imagine living.
She's the one who worked longest on all of these, of all of the 5.
I think Ida Lewis worked the longest. She was very heroic. She saved between 18 and 36 lives. She was right off of Newport, Rhode Island. And there's actually a good poem about her, My First Rescue, that maybe...
Sure, do you want to go to that?
Yeah, now this is a really interesting story. And this happens to also be in a very new anthology called Forgotten Women that's put out by Grey Wolf Press. And a few of us are going to read these poems at the Mass Poetry Festival. And so this just shows what a hero she is.
And what's the name of this particular?
This is called Forgotten Women.
Forgotten, and the keeper we're talking about right now
is Ida Lewis. Right, her real name was Ida Wally Lewis. And she came out with her father and mother, but her father had had a stroke and her mother was ill, and very quickly she became the primary lighthouse keeper. But she worked for 20 years without a contract, where they paid the father even though he was injured, and then when he died they paid the mother. So it took her 20 years till she was recognized.
Wow. Talking about pay disparity.
Yes. So this is called My First Rescue. On that September day, I spied the pitching catboat, heard the laughter, 4 about my age, 16, sons of Newport's finest, I guess, judging by the boat, the sleek and shiny hug 'em snug, all hooting, wrestling. Then one of them waving his arms and suddenly shimmying up the mast so that, top-heavy, the boat plunged into the churning sea and took on water until the whole hull rolled toward sky, dumping all the young men into the cold and choppy Atlantic. The upturned hull, slippery, frigid, so small only 2 could grasp it, the others treading water, gasping, all screaming, "Help!" I jumped into my skiff, rowed hard and fast across the surf, until beside them I stabilized my boat with 1 oar, and drew them, like Pa had taught, 1 by 1, across the stern, into the skiff, and hauled back to the island. To fireplace, blankets, Mama's molasses toddies. One of them, tall and hazel-eyed, Samuel Powell unconscious. but once revived, grabbed my hand, shook it until it hurt, and gushed, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And yet, on the mainland, it would be 11 years when the evening news proclaimed me heroine for a day. Before he admitted to his family, it was a mere keeper's daughter who'd saved his lucky life.
Very nice. That's I think that's eloquent, but at the same time, it's got political force that's very relevant today and relevant to that pay. Well, beyond discrepancy,
Yes,
that
yes.
she had to suffer.
There's another one that I imagined her writing to the Board of Lighthouses because she didn't have a contract for 20 years.
Another lighthouse keeper.
No,
Or
it's the
another
same.
pump.
It's the same
one.
one.
Okay, sure.
It's kind
please.
of I think that's an important.
This is Lewis again.
This is Ida Lewis, who saved 36 lives.
What page are you going
Okay,
to?
that's on page 27. So this is my imagining that she would write a letter to the superintendent of lighthouses. After 20 years working without a contract, Ida considers addressing the superintendent of lighthouses. 1. Mark this island on your cartography of complaint. Does it offend you, Mr. Silk Suspendered Pinstripe? A reporter's admiration for my accomplishments despite chignon and petticoat? The photo in the evening news, my scarf tied fashionably across the bodice of my poplin dress. 2. Who saved more lives than I? And yet I am rewarded with trinkets, a medal, citations, a skiff so plush and awkward I leave it tethered to a stone. A man would have a stipend, a contract to protect him. I serve, and yet please do not confuse compliance with lack of passion. 3. Last week I heard a scream, jumped into my skiff, and rowed to a soldier foundering in the harbor, pulled him over my stern, thumped him on the back, and sculled him home. Difficult, but not so heroic as wrenching prejudgment from its menacing, unmarked channel.
Very nice, very nicely done. I can really hear her anger in that wonderful close from its menacing, unmarked channel. Very, very strong. Now, have we named all of the 5?
No, Abby Burgess was a young woman on Mantinigus Island who at 17, Mantinigus Island is 20 miles off of Rockland, Maine. And so sometimes if the weather was bad, they wouldn't get their supplies because it was so far. So, and her mother was weak. She was the oldest of 4 siblings. There was a boy who was older than her, but he went off and did his own thing fishing. So her father would have to go and get supplies if they didn't have any. He'd have to do that 20 miles to shore, like in a skiff. And the mother needed medicine, so he left one day, and of course a storm came in and he couldn't get back for 3 weeks. And the weather was so bad that the waves washed over the island, and she at 17 was really in charge, and she led them to carry their mattresses up to the tower, and she saved the chickens so they would have something to eat, and they stayed in the tower and for 3 weeks until virtually there was nothing left, and finally the father came. And in fact, this happened 3 times during their family life on the island.
And there is a picture of her as well. A
Yes.
picture. She's fairly young in this.
Yes.
Very strong looking. Very almost austere, perhaps.
Well, I think she looks austere here in this picture, but she was really quite attractive, and she ended up marrying someone who came to the island. After President Lincoln became president, they were political appointments then, and her father had to leave the island. And the keeper who came in, she ended up marrying the son. So she ended up spending her whole life living on islands. But I do have this poem about her, about learning how it was to be a lighthouse keeper.
About Abby.
Yes,
Abby Bridges.
and then there's one about.
Burgess,
Then there's another part about the storm. I don't know. Would you
Please, yes.
Okay, so this is called Learning Mentinicus Light. And the first part takes place in 1853, and that's when she came as a child, about 15. I'm different here, I say, as Pa leads me up the 48 lighthouse stairs. No skittering chipmunks, but moon snails pluck, quahogs grit, the cleverness of gulls. I've learned that I am small, the sea immense, and that the Atlantic gathers time and releases it capriciously. That this new world is ours, that it alters with the tides. I've learned to listen for the sea's anger, to relax into its calm. I've seen that whales live in families called pods, that the elders care for the helpless young. Ships depend on us, Pa explains, as he shows me how to light the 28 argon lamps, fill the oil pan, trim wicks. Yesterday, I found a sand dollar washed up on the rocks, and considering the eternal churning of surf, tossed it back into the sea. Then in 1856, that's when her father went ashore to get supplies. The Atlantic growls around my boot-clad feet the day Pa sails away to get supplies. Keep the light burning, he tells me. Ma ailing, my sister small and needy, and that night a storm comes thumping, the surf rising until it crashes against the bolted kitchen door. I peer out a window to see a wave wash over the chicken coop, threatening our pet hens. Priscilla! I race into the surge to gather my pet in my arms. Charlie and Hope are next, until all but one are safe beside the stove. And when I look out again, the hen house is gone. Those who imagine snow as white haven't seen a northeaster, gray shrieking into blizzard black. The landing dock dissolved, I drag bedding up the tower stairs, coax Ma and my fidgety sisters to the lantern room, where safety smells of whale oil and January cold. For 3 weeks I fill those lamps, scrape ice with mittened hands. We survive on eggs and dried fruit, and in those weeks no ship is lost. From the mainland, Father sees us safe, a small light in a vast storm.
Very nicely done. I love the idea that the Atlantic gathers time. And I had marked that earlier when I read it. That's a wonderful, that's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
You feel it, don't you?
We're getting close to the end of our time. I want to ask you, what's next on your poetry schedule for creativity?
Well, I do have entire book that has 6 women lighthouse keepers in it, which has extra poems for each lighthouse keeper. And
excuse me, are these different women? Or
They're-
does he include these?
they include these 5, but there's a new poem for each one, at least. And it also includes Barbara Maberty, who is a woman lighthouse keeper in Key West, Florida. And I have a book of odes that I sent out. Odes to, it ends with an ode to Maxine Kumin, who was my mentor, one of my mentors at New England College. But it has odes to like more common things, like ode to yesterday's 5 and 10.
Oh, a fond memory.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember Maxine Kumin. I worked with her at Breadloaf
Oh, did you?
many years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
And she died, 4 years ago,
Yeah,
perhaps?
just about. Yeah, I really
2014,
I
perhaps?
really enjoyed working with her, and she was one person that I was able to keep contact with throughout the years until she passed away.
What advice do you have for poets who are watching this, especially women poets or girls in school, if they're interested in women's history, women's empowerment, and writing? What should they do?
Well, I guess if you're interested in women's empowerment, I think if you can find someone that really inspires you, like Maria Bray, how that led me to be passionate about the future of women and where we are today, that would be a good start. I think to read as much as you can, and especially to read poetry if you'd like to write poetry.
And let's plug your book, Read Mind the Light. And where is this available?
It is available on the press, which is Quill's Edge Press. It can be ordered from them. They have a website. There are some at the bookstore in Gloucester, or they could certainly contact me.
So let me repeat that. It's Quills, as in the old writing device, Edge Press. And their website is quills, plural, ADGE, press.com.
It's a wonderful press. It's for women over 50. And they really give inspiration and support to women
Where are they
over
located?
50. They're in New Jersey, I believe. I'm not sure.
Sue Ellen Wedmore, I want to thank you very much for sharing
Thank you.
Mind the Light with us and the women who did that work on the lighthouses on the East Coast and sharing your poetry. I've enjoyed the
you.
half hour very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank you out there in television cable land for being with us too. If you've learned something about the women who once minded lighthouses from this wonderful poet guest this evening, Sue Ellen Wedmore, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.